Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Eric Remensperger has been a practicing lawyer for over 30 years, but for the last 20 years, his passion has been all things relating to wellness. Prior to moving from New York to Los Angeles in 1995, he went from a work hard, play hard Wall Street lawyer to a gym rat and then a serious biohacker. The transition started in earnest in 1997 after he became the money partner in a holistic centre with a doctor of Chinese medicine. His passion continued and he was, he thought he was, the healthiest 59-year-old on the planet. That all changed, unfortunately, in June of 2016 when he was diagnosed with an advanced stage of prostate cancer. This pushed him even deeper into this passion for health and wellness, and he did an incredible dive into all things relating to cancer, from the causes to the therapies and interventions. His ability to take a big picture perspective of a complex disease and filter out the signal from all the noise is amazing. While he does not like to use the word cure, since in his view, it's more a matter of getting into a healing state, which I'm sure we'll go into, he was declared to be in remission 7 months after he was first diagnosed, which is amazing. I think you'll find this story and his insights fascinating. Eric, welcome to the show and thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Ali. It's good to speak to you again after we recently met at the PaleoFX conference.
Yeah, look, it was great to meet you and your story was fascinating and I'd heard it before and was just so inspired to meet you. So I guess, can we share a brief rundown of your story, as you mentioned, from a smoker to a gym rat?
Sure. I was probably the furthest thing from healthy prior to 1992. I was living in New York City, and I know you're in New York City, so you kind of know the lifestyle there. And I was a workaholic. I was a heavy smoker, 2-pack a day. I was a heavy drinker. And my pride came from how hard I worked. And I was the last thing that you would consider to be when you would think of health. I kind of went through, I guess, a sort of midlife crisis that started to hit me. And in 1992, I quit smoking cigarettes and then moved to Los Angeles. I was working for the New York office of a big LA firm. And I transplanted myself to Los Angeles in 1995. And shortly after that, I became a gym rat. I was turning 40 and I was looking pretty ratty and I really wanted to try to be physically fit and have some real body tone. So I became an absolute gym rat and I was going to the gym every single day for an hour and a half. And as you can imagine, I was doing the Men's Health diet too, which is, high protein, your Myoplex shakes after you work out, that sort of thing. And of course, I had good transformation of my physique. For the first time in my life, I had muscle tone and I really trimmed out and I looked great. I was, no fat, high protein, my whole wheat toast. I had the same thing to eat every day, oatmeal with nothing but unsweetened applesauce for breakfast. My turkey sandwich on whole wheat bread with mustard and pickles for lunch, and then comes skinless chicken breast and steamed vegetables for dinner. And I did this for a long time. But I was suffering some real chronic conditions that just plagued me for a long, long time. And I never really gave much thought to alternative medicine or energetic healing or anything of that sort. And I had seen every doctor in the world that I could come across to help me with those chronic conditions, one of which was a chronic cough. And in that process, I actually met this doctor who practiced acupuncture at the time, and he cured me of all those ailments. And I was so amazed that I decided that I would invest with him, and we opened a holistic center together. And that kind of got me started on this journey. And I just was so fascinated by the power of, nutrition and meditation and proper movement and, good sleep and all these things and how it can impact your health, that I kind of just continued to go down that rabbit hole. I went through a lot of different transitions, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners have, where I kind of went through a period where I was, plant-based, vegan. I was a raw vegan for a while, and then I went crazy and I became a raw omnivore when I met this guy named Ozone Vanderplanets, who was the original kind of primal diet book. And he was a big proponent of, raw dairy, raw butter, raw meat, not a lot of vegetables. And I did that for a while. And then I kind of gravitated into more just a standard paleo diet because it seemed to do best for me and I felt really healthy. And I got into yoga as my primary form of movement exercise, although I still did some resistance work. And I was doing grounding and all the stuff you think about, clean water out of glass bottles from spring water, all this stuff. And I was actually at the PaleoFX conference in June of 2016 when I had my first symptoms that I had some sort of health condition. And it was difficulty urinating and pain in my bladder. And I thought it was the result of my having, they had on the exhibition hall floor, they had this electrostimulation device, and they decided I would show off to my friends and had put in my lower abs and turn on full blast. I remember standing there thinking, this is the stupidest thing I think I've ever done because it's so painful and they can't show it because my friends are all watching me. And so that next morning when I was having difficulty urinating, I thought, well, that must be it. I probably just tweaked my bladder. But it continued for a week after I got back from Austin, Texas. And so I saw a doctor, and long story short, I went through a whole series of tests, the standard tests that they run you through my urologist. And he told me after he did the full biopsy that not only did I have prostate cancer, I had stage 4 prostate cancer because it was outside the prostate, it was in the bones and in the lymph nodes, all luckily in the groin area. And it was Gleason score 9, a very aggressive form of cancer. And so he said, you really have to be very concerned and you need to jump on this. And of course, that just completely stopped my world. I was just completely taken back. I remember thinking at the time, I was just so floored. I thought maybe all this stuff I had been doing to try to be healthy was just a waste of time. And I should have just been eating McDonald's and pizza and continued to do what I did when I was in New York. But then I kind of stepped back and I thought, I've been so passionate about wellness for so long that this is really giving me something that I can sink my teeth into because I want to beat this thing. And in order for me to do it, I had to do a very deep dive and come to my own determination as to what I considered to be the causes of cancer. And I'm sure we're going to get into that on this podcast. I wasn't willing to make any decisions with regard to what protocols I would adopt or therapies I would adopt until I had a sense for exactly what it was that I was dealing with. And that's just my lawyerly way of looking at the world. That's kind of how we do things. And so I spent a very intensive period of about 20 days, and I went through 17 books in that 20-day period. And when I say 17 books, I mean 17 books. There were a lot more than 17. I would skim through it and just throw it aside if I thought it wasn't going to be worthwhile. But the ones that I thought had some real substance, I would drill down and really read them. It was fascinating to me because the more I kind of did this overview, the more I could see that there really is a split in the cancer community on what the theories of cancer are. This is long before I stumbled upon, I had read Travis Christofferson's book. Obviously, it was a great book. But I didn't know about Tom Seyfried other than what was in that book. And I hadn't listened to Tom or read Tom's book. For those that don't know, Tom Seyfried wrote the book called Cancer is a Metabolic Disease. And when I read those books and I kind of looked between the lines, when I kind of looked behind the words and really tried to understand what it was they were saying, it became quite apparent to me that they were onto something, that there really was a metabolic trigger that would cause the formation of cancer cells. And so that's kind of in a nutshell where I was then. And if you want me to go on, I can kind of talk a little bit about those two theories, the whole theory that's kind of predominant in Western medicine, which is, there's a DNA defect that causes cancer versus kind of this alternative theory that it's due to a defect in the cellular respiration.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're on a roll, so can you go into that?
Okay, yeah, because I love it when I can get on a soapbox and talk about this stuff, as you probably can tell.
Well, I think it's important for people to know, it's quite unknown out there. It took you 17 books, and even then you still probably didn't quite get to those two theories.
Right. It's interesting because I could see how all of the doctors that were trained in classical medicine, your traditional allopathic doctors, the doctors that practice standard of care, as we say, they have been very well trained in medical school to have a very clear perspective that there is a defect in the genome that's a trigger of cancer. And that's kind of the approach that they use. And there's now this kind of shift taking place where you have some of the major medical centers that are considering that there might be other options. The whole metabolic theory started back in 1938, I believe it was, when Otto Warburg got the Nobel Prize for discovering that all cancer cells shifted from traditional form of energy production, which is using oxygen, it's a traditional respiration process, to a more prehistoric form of energy production, which is fermentation, where the cancer is using glucose and creating lactic acid. It's interesting to note, and we're going to probably touch on this more than once, that all life forms that existed on the planet before there was oxygen on the planet involved with energy production necessarily used fermentation as its energy production process. Cancer cells are nothing more really than healthy cells that for whatever reason have stopped respirating and converted over to this prehistoric form of energy production. And they proliferate because they kind of fall off the grid and they no longer play by the rules which all cells play by. And when I discovered that, it kind of really opened my eyes to the fact that there was a way of addressing the cancer condition using hypoxia, because oxygen obviously is extremely important for healthy cells and it's toxic for most cancer cells. So there's kind of this oxidative therapy. And when we get a little bit later on into the therapeutic interventions, I can talk a little bit about, what oxygenation therapeutic interventions that I adopted that I think people might take a look at who are struggling with the disease. But I think the most telling thing for me, and probably it's interesting that this was overlooked, because the Warburg theory kind of came out before the mitochondria really was fully understood. And there was a guy named Pete Peterson who discovered the mitochondria and found that there was a defect in the mitochondria that was tied into this inability of the cells to respirate properly. That was actually kind of the main focus until this discovery of the DNA occurred. And at that point, all eyes shifted to kind of the genome. And we thought the bulk of the scientists were of the view that all of our conditions were caused by DNA sequencing. In other words, your DNA would dictate. So if your DNA said you would have cancer, you would end up with cancer, which we now know is not true, because there's this overlay that's been used over the last 10 years, which is called epigenetics, which is nothing more than epigenetics, meaning over genes. It means that your lifestyle choices will determine which of your genes get turned on and which get turned off, which really has a bigger impact on your health outcomes than the fact that you happen to have a specific genome sequence. Although I do think if you could have weak links in your DNA, and therefore you need to be more cautious if you're so inclined to go through the 23andMe and discover what you have a propensity for, like the BRCA gene, which we all know about. It doesn't mean you're going to get breast cancer, but it does mean you have to be more cautious to make sure that you're staying healthy, because you have kind of a weak link there. But I think the most telling thing was when a group of scientists at 2 different universities took the nucleus of cancer cell and insert it into the cytoplasm of a healthy cell that had its nucleus removed. This reconstituted cell, if you will, was then injected into mice. And out of 68 mice in the first test, only 1 had a tumor after a 1-year period. To me, that's kind of proof that healthy mitochondria could turn off the genome and prevent the disease from occurring. The same experiment was done in another university with 10 mice, and none of them got cancer. But then they ran the experiment in reverse. This is particularly telling, where they took the nucleus of a healthy cell and insert it into the cytoplasm of a tumor cell that had its nucleus removed, and 98% of those cells developed cancer. So if that isn't a good, I think, indicator or strong evidence, again, as an attorney, I would have no trouble arguing that's pretty compelling evidence that it's a metabolic disease. In other words, if there's a problem with the mitochondria, the cells are not able to produce energy in the traditional fashion, and therefore it reverts to this kind of prehistoric form of fermentation. And so once I was able to kind of come to that, I had to then say, okay, well, wait a second. Okay, that makes perfect sense to me. I accept this theory. And I don't think that the genome sequencing problem is the cause of the disease, but I think it's the result of the disease. In other words, it's the effect, not the cause. And that's why we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars since Nixon declared the war on cancer, kind of chasing this genome impact and trying to come up with pharmaceutical drugs that can somehow address these genomes, but they can't find any consistency in the genome sequencing that would allow them to do that. They find even within the same cancer and the same individuals that develop more than one tumor, they find different DNA sequencing problems. So to me, that's a complete dead end.
Eric, it sounds like you came to that conclusion pretty easily once you read the evidence of the studies of the mice and what have you. How many people in the industry would actually agree with you? So if you were to have a guess at say, what percentage of doctors would actually still believe that it's actually the genome sequence?
I would, if you asked a traditionally trained oncologist, I would say it's probably a very small sliver, less than 1%. And it's probably those that have come out of medical school fairly recently that are young and open-minded. Maybe it's a much bigger percentage, those who have adopted more of an alternative-based medicine treatment protocol. Because I think most traditional oncologists that are classically trained are kind of forced to use standard of care. And so they have to follow kind of the more traditional theory, which is you need radiation treatment, you need chemotherapy, we need to remove whatever cancer we can. And I'm not saying chemotherapy or radiation or surgery are never indicated. I wouldn't purport to even have enough authority to say that. But what I am saying is that there are other alternatives that should be considered either in conjunction with or as an alternative to those treatments, depending on the stage of the disease and condition of the patient. I was, I think, fortunate in that I was very, very healthy when I got the disease. So it was easier, I think, for my body to kind of get back into a healing state. And let me just step back for a second. I want to get back to your question. I like to use the word cancering as a verb. People typically talk about cancer. It's really just the symptom of a disease. when you talk about having cancer, you're talking about a diagnosis that has occurred as a result of having been cancering for a long period of time. Because a tumor will only show up after your tumor cells have been generating for 5 years or 6 years or 7 years or more. Any of the allopathic treatments will go after the symptom, but not necessarily get to the cause. And I want to circle back to that.
So sorry, Eric,
Yeah,
on that then, if you're cancering, does that mean you're either cancering or you're healing?
Correct. So a person who has been diagnosed with cancer needs to understand that, okay, you have a symptom now of a disease condition. If it's acute, you absolutely should go to your allopathic doctor and follow their protocols. By acute, I mean a life-threatening condition. So I think Western medicine is fabulous. If you've been in a car accident, you have a bad infection, or there are certain things that are really important where you just don't want to be using kind of alternative treatments to address. And if you have a tumor that's blocking your digestion and it's blocking the vein that's going to supply blood to your brain, these are all what I consider acute conditions. You don't mess around with that at all. But cancer, the creation from a healthy cell to a cancerous cell is part of the normal cellular process. When I say normal, I mean it's not what you want, but it happens all the time to everyone. Everyone has, to a certain extent, has some cells that are going to go off the grid. And your immune system will typically address those conditions and address those cells, and you never really develop the symptom of the disease, which we call cancer. So a person who's been diagnosed needs to really kind of shift from the cancering state, because they've been cancering for a long time. That's why they've now been diagnosed with the symptom, and shift themselves back into a healing state. And once you can do that, then your body will really kind of heal itself. With cancer, unfortunately, you have to use a very multimodal approach. And I really get frustrated when I hear alternative practitioners who say all you need to do is drink carrot juice or do coffee enemas or this or that, and it'll cure your cancer. Because I don't believe that. I think it takes really a lot of different approaches, including kind of changing your internal landscape. But just quickly to get back to your question, I think if you talk to integrative doctors who really understand, who focus on oncology but are not in the allopathic space, naturopaths, that sort of thing, I think you will find a much, much larger percentage of them will consider this to be, the problem is not with the DNA, but it's the energy production, inability for the mitochondria to function well.
I don't mean to be cynical, or maybe I do, but if you're saying so that oncologists, probably 99% of them would go with this genome sort of philosophy, is that not slightly correlated to, and I could be wrong, but in the US, and I'm not sure about every country, but don't oncologists actually get paid by the treatment that they give?
Yeah. I mean, we could definitely do a whole podcast on that. I don't criticize doctors because the training they get in medical school is really, I think the curriculum is kind of focused on pharmaceutical-based treatments. It's pharmaceutical interventions as kind of the primary. It's either surgery or pharmaceutical interventions. And so that's how they're trained, and that's what they know. And when they get out of medical school, that's, again, they continue to be trained in that space. So there really is not much currently today that incentivizes, to get back to your question, doctors to, in fact, I'd say there's the system, the way it's created now with insurance companies and, licensing requirements, et cetera, that a doctor could lose his or her license to practice medicine if they were to go outside the standard of care. They certainly could be subject to malpractice lawsuits, which they're protected from as long as they stay within the standard of care. So there's all sorts of incentives in addition to the fact that they make a lot of their money. And by the way, you'll find this interesting. Talk about, I don't want to, again, sound too cynical here, and to my friends who are oncologists, but in all branches of medicine I'm aware of, other than oncology, the doctor does not prescribe the medicine. That's done intentionally just to avoid an incentive for the doctor to overprescribe medicine. They write a prescription, and then the pharmacy fills the prescription, and that's how you get your medication. Oncology is the only branch of medicine where the doctor sells you the drugs. And so there's a real large percentage of their revenue generation comes from selling these chemotherapy drugs.
Interesting. And actually that is country dependent, because Japan and Hong Kong, two countries in which I've lived, any GP that you go to, they'll actually write the prescription and you will get the drugs there at the doctor's. So
I see. Well,
you tend to get a lot of drugs.
Yes. And I think for those who have gone to kind of naturopaths and DOs, more kind of functional based practitioners, you'll find the same thing. They'll have a whole pharmacy of their supplements and their vitamins and their various kind of natural herbal remedies and that sort of thing. You all buy right there at the office. So there is some of that as well on the other side of the fence too, in the natural space.
So Eric, I just wanted to backtrack a little bit. I wanted to ask you, and it might be hard for you to recall exactly what went through your mind and your emotions. On, I believe it was a Wednesday that you actually found out you had cancer. Someone who was the fittest guy in the world just got told they had cancer. Can you talk us through the next, say, month, that night maybe, and the next month?
Yeah, let me talk about leading up to that evening too, because I had been going through, as I mentioned earlier, a battery of tests, all of which suggested that I could have cancer, right? I mean, clearly my prostate was swollen to 2.5 times its normal size. And I had other indications, it was malformed. I was having difficulty urinating. My PSA level was 21.1 at the time. I mean, there were all sorts of things that indicated that I had some serious condition in the prostate. I was trying to kind of maintain a positive attitude and saying, no, this is not cancer. This is benign prostate hyperplasia, BPH. And I'm fine. And I just need to figure out why my prostate is swollen because there's no way I could have cancer. I'm too healthy. And so it really was the biopsy was kind of the final test that would indicate exactly what was going on. And I remember it was about 8 o'clock at night, and I don't watch a lot of television. I was watching TV to just trying to keep my mind off of my condition when the phone rang, and it was my urologist. And he just didn't mince words at all. I mean, I was surprised he was calling me at 8 o'clock at night. He and I are friends, and that's the kind of doctor he is. He said, look, I just got the test results, and you have very advanced cancer. I remember at that point, the experience I had was almost as if, I'm sure everyone's had the experience where you kind of stand up when you have low blood sugar and you feel like you're going to pass out. I felt like that times 10. I felt like my whole world had just completely came to a stop and I just was numb. Initially, I was just numb. I didn't know how to feel. I was in shock, really, is what it was. I was completely in shock. When the shock wore off, which is probably that same evening, when my thoughts are racing through my head, of course, I started crying and I felt at a complete loss that here I was doing everything I possibly could to be as healthy as I possibly could. And now I was facing imminent death due to some serious health condition. And I just was beside myself. And it probably took 2 days for me to get out of that really complete funk where I just couldn't see straight. I was feeling sorry for myself, rightfully so, I think. And then once I kind of stood over myself, kind of looked down at myself and said, wait a second, what are you crying for? This is something that you really are going to have to take charge of. Interestingly enough, and we can talk a little about the prostate, because the prostate is the organ that sits where the root chakra is. And the root chakra, for those that kind of know some of the principles of alternative medicine, is the chakra that supports procreative and protocreative energy, right? Procreative, obviously, being sexual energy, the ability to procreate. Protocreative is very similar, but it's creating things out in the world. It's like getting out and conquering the world. Both those energies come from that root chakra. And that's where I was completely stagnant for about 4 years. And so I thought about that because I learned a little bit about Chinese medicine. I don't purport to be a doctor of Chinese medicine by any stretch, but I learned a little bit about it when I was working with the doctor of Chinese medicine at that holistic center up in Montrose that we started and was open for about 4 years. He taught me a lot. I thought, okay, well, I can kind of see now maybe why I got cancer, because I had completely stagnated my qi in that region of my body. And, we can talk a little bit about Chinese medicine and organs and qi, but as soon as I kind of came to that realization, then I think it really got me fired up to say, I need to do a deep dive. I need to understand this. Even if I'm only going to live for a year or 2 years or 4 years or 5, whatever it is, I just want to know this. I want to know what it is. I want to understand it.
What exactly do you mean by you sort of stagnated that root chakra for 4 years?
It's public because I talked about it on the podcast, but I don't like to be too public about it. But I was stepping out of the marriage and doing things I shouldn't do. So I had become celibate for 4 years. My wife and I are separated and we were going through a really difficult time, and I decided I was just going to be celibate. So I was just completely celibate, no masturbation, no nothing for 4 years. And so that was kind of the procreative stagnation. The protocreative stagnation was very similar. I'm still a partner at a big law firm, and I continue to have a practice, and I like my job. I do. I like my clients. I like my partners. They've been great. What I do, I'm good at. My passion was wellness. That's what floated my boat. That's what really got me excited. I wouldn't sit up at night reading books on the Uniform Commercial Code, but I would sit up at night reading books about wellness. And if I found a really good author, and there's some out there, I would just do a really deep dive and try to understand the stuff and see how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. And so I wanted to move into the wellness space, and I wanted to do it for 4 years or 5 years before I got diagnosed. I mean, I literally was going out and getting URLs. I had Primal Professional. I had paleocentral. I had all these crazy things where I thought, I'm going to move into the space and this is going to be my next passion project. But I just couldn't pull the trigger because I realized when I kind of looked at it realistically that nobody really cares what some, lawyer says about wellness. When I got diagnosed with cancer, obviously, I had a story to tell. And so I felt like, okay, now my passion found a purpose. But that was the stagnation on the proto-creative side. In other words, my heart was pulling me in that direction, but I was just not going there. I was just completely stuck in the mud.
And do you remember how long it took you? You mentioned 2 days where you just felt sorry for yourself. Do you remember how long it took to where you thought, actually, no, I'm going to fight this?
It's hard for me to fully collect the exact time because it might have been not just necessarily epiphany, but more a slow drip. But I think it was certainly no more than 4 or 5 days. I probably, out of 2 days, just decided I needed to do something, but it probably took me a day or two to get fired up about it. But one thing I did do, I must have had some intuitive sense that I had issues with my prostate because I had been reading this book, which I do not recommend, on prostate health. And in the book, the author recommended that you do a master cleanse. I had that book on my shelf and I kept looking at it thinking, do I need to do this stuff? I'm going to be 50 years old and I want to make sure I have a healthy prostate. And I kind of just read through the book, but I never really did any of the things in the book. But I decided as soon as I came back from Austin, Texas, before I even got the diagnosis, I decided, I know there's a problem with my prostate. That's what's causing me to be unable to urinate. I'm going to do the master cleanse. And so I went out and I bought a bunch of lemons and some maple syrup and cayenne pepper. And I don't know if your listeners probably have heard of it, but what it is basically, a fasting program where you only drink this concoction that's made from water, lemon juice, cayenne pepper, and maple syrup. And so I bought enough to do the full 10-day cleanse. And I didn't make it past the first day when I just went into sugar shock because I was pretty fat adapted at that point. So my body was very happy burning fat and was not thrilled when I overloaded my levels of glucose. And so I thought, okay, this is not going to work. This is definitely not going to work. There's just way too much sugar in this. And so I thought, well, let me just do a water fast. And so I did a water fast. I was going to do 10 days. And I think it was on the 8th day when my body said to me, okay, it's time to start eating again. Because up to that point, I felt fine. I felt perfectly happy, plenty of energy, no problems at all. And so I think that in and of itself kind of kickstarted my healing process because what it did was it not only put me into autophagy, but it also put me in a therapeutic level of burning ketones, of ketosis, because that's the quickest way to get your ketone levels way up is just to do a long fast. That was almost intuitive. I mean, I didn't really think about it. I just did it. And it turns out it was probably the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you mentioned back before that you had a PSA level of 21. It's generally under 1, isn't it, if you're quite healthy?
If you look at the blood test results that you get from a standard hospital or blood center, they say you want to be under 4, but I think most people like to be under 1.
And your Gleason score was 9. I mean, that sounds high. What's the actual highest score you can get?
That is the highest score you can get.
Oh, okay. So you did well. So surely you must have been thinking, did you even ask the question of how long you had to live?
I didn't ask the question because I didn't want to know the answer because I'm worried about there's this whole idea that the nocebo effect is as strong as the placebo effect. So if someone thinks they're going to die in 2 years and they honestly believe it, then chances are they will die in 2 years, right? So a lot of people say, well, prostate cancer is very slow and you can live your whole life and die of something else, which is true. It happens quite often. Based on my limited experience, just from my own perspective, because I'm not speaking for anybody but myself on this, a lot of the folks I think that have suffered really adverse outcomes for certain cancers has been more the result of their treatments than the cancer itself. And so I was very circumspect as to exactly what treatments I was going to use. I wanted to make sure I didn't fall into that category. And so I decided that, okay, I'm going to really kind of step back. And surgery, luckily, wasn't an option. They don't do surgery when you have this advanced a stage of cancer. They won't take the prostate out. Normally, in the old days, they would. And then they give you radiation and or chemotherapy. I did have an oncologist who I went to see. I interviewed so many doctors.
Talk us through that process, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I wanted to have a standard oncologist that I could lean on, so I understood what my options are using allopathic medicine. And I went to the top oncologist for prostate cancer here in Los Angeles. And of course, he told me about his credentials and who he was and how he did things. And, it was basically his way or the highway. And I didn't like that. But he also said to me, which I found particularly troubling, and I think it's one of the reasons why I just decided I was going to go elsewhere. He said, if we do chemotherapy in conjunction with your ADT or androgen deprivation treatment, chemical castration, we can talk about that. He said, we can extend your life by 7 months.
Great.
and I sat there looking at him and I thought to myself, wow, I can't believe he just said that. Because I don't know how anybody can say with a straight face when someone would have died, because everyone's different. The problem with when you talk about evidence-based medicine is most of it is based on statistics, really. They just put a lump of people together as the control group and a lump of people together as the placebo group, and then they just kind of run through the numbers and say, okay, which one had better outcomes? But you don't know all the variables that fit into people's lives in either of those groups that could really skew those numbers. And so that analysis, I thought, well, that's ridiculous. How could you say that? You're telling me that instead of dying in December, I'll die in July if I do this chemotherapy? I would rather die in December and then live to July and go through chemotherapy.
And I'm sure most of our listeners are fairly aware of what chemotherapy involves, although I'm sure it's different for each patient. But what was the other therapy or treatment that he was suggesting?
I was also recommended to do radiation treatment, which I turned down as well. The most, I think, prevalent form, which is one I think that I did only because you can undo it, is androgen deprivation. It's not permanent. They inject a drug into your system called Lupron, and there's new versions of it, but Lupron is the one that's been around for a long time, that effectively shuts down the body's production of testosterone, actually all the sexual hormones. Prostate cancer is a hormone-based cancer. It's fed by sexual hormones, in this case, testosterone. And so by shutting that down, you effectively kind of shrink the prostate. It's like a weed killer, if you will. It doesn't kill the cancer necessarily, but it certainly alleviates a lot of the symptoms because your prostate will shrink and you can start urinating again, et cetera. I do the Lupron. I did it and I cycle off and I cycle back on when my PSA goes up. If you can get to a healing state where your body's functioning well, you just stop taking it and your body will start producing testosterone again. So it's not something that's kind of permanent. Whereas, radiation is quite permanent.
But was that your idea to sort of cycle on and off?
It was my idea only because, I did some research. I went into PubMed and I read a bunch of studies which concluded, and these are, strong evidence-based studies and under major clinical trials, they said that there's no benefit, but there's no harm. I say, how could you say that? If there's no harm, there has to be a benefit. There's a lot of reasons why your body produces testosterone that have nothing to do with reproduction. It's bone health. Ability of your bones to regenerate is dependent upon testosterone. So one of the adverse health consequences of being on Lupron for a long period of time is you start losing some of your bone mass. And so you want to cycle off this so your body can start functioning the way it should.
And you mentioned that if your PSA goes up, then you go back on it. Have you had to do that again?
I have, because my PSA started to climb when I was off of it. And so I got back on it. And now my PSA is down. So I'm weighing my options to cycle back off. I was doing 1 month-to-month Lupron shots. And I shifted over to 90-day Lupron shots. You do once every 3 months. And so, it just saved me a lot of trips to the doctor. But I still get my PSA levels checked monthly. So I am on Lupron as we speak. But I'm to the point now where my levels are low enough that I'm considering my options and cycling back off again.
Okay. And so how many oncologists did you interview?
I saw about 6, including some that were outside the LA area and some who were not specialists in prostate cancer. In fact, the first oncologist I worked with was somebody local that I liked who was very flexible, but he was not a prostate specialist. But I'm now working with a fabulous doctor here in Santa Monica who just does prostate cancer, Dr. Twardowski. I'd say the primary condition that I imposed to hiring a doctor was that they had to be flexible. They had to be somebody that I could work with. If they just said, look, this is what you have to do, and I'm not going to hear otherwise, then I would say, okay, thank you. I'll continue to look and find someone else. My current doctor understands that. He knows exactly where my head is at. And he's willing to go along with me because he sees the outcome of how it's been working for me. And so how can you argue against it?
So how did you go from cancering, let's say, to, we won't say cured because, like you said, it's more healing. How did you go in 7 months to that? What actually did you implement and when, like how long after you found out, and how long were you on those therapies for?
Okay. Well, there's several therapies that I did that were all kind of fell into the same basket. When we remember early on when I talked about hypoxia, these are oxidative therapies because cancer likes an oxygen-free environment. Oxygen can be very toxic to cancer cells. And I know most of your listeners probably when they think of oxidation, they think of free radical damage, but really all it means is an interaction of oxygen with another substance. And I decided I was willing to take on some potential free radical issues in exchange for kind of having natural chemotherapeutic benefit of hypoxia. There are, I think, three primary ways you do that. One is hyperbaric oxygen, which is used primarily as a therapy for skin lesions and also for divers who have serious problems if you get the bends. It's not FDA approved for metastatic cancer, but I've talked to enough people that have had issues with metastases who have had really good results using hyperbaric. And since I did have metastatic cancer, I decided I was going to adopt that. And I found a chamber center here in LA that I could go to. And I went initially for 3 times a week for a session. And those sessions were long. It's an hour and a half, right? It takes 15 minutes to get to pressure and then 15 minutes to get out. And then you're at pressure for an hour. For those that are interested in hyperbaric, you want to make sure it's, I think, a hard-sided chamber. Those soft-sided chambers don't develop enough pressure really to do the function. And you want medical-grade oxygen. So I was doing that to address the metastases. I was also doing ozone, and there are several ways you can do ozone. You can do it in the blood. I was doing rectal insufflation at home. It's just supercharged oxygen that has 3 atoms. It's O3 instead of O2. And after 20 or 30 minutes inside the body, that extra atom breaks off. And there was a study done back in 1980. Now, of course, this is in vitro, but exposure to ozone at as little as 0.8 parts per million inhibited the growth of cancer cells by more than 90%, because cancer cells just can't defend against ozone. It's also effective against fungus, and they use it for Lyme disease. There's a lot of other reasons why ozone is powerful, but cancer cells traditionally can't survive in the presence of ozone, where healthy cells are enriched by it. Of course, you can't breathe it because it's toxic if you get it in your lungs. But I was doing that at home. I have a machine at home. And then the third way I was doing it is high-dose vitamin C. And you kind of ask, well, how's that a pro-oxidant? Vitamin C in low doses is an antioxidant. So if you just take your 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams, 1 or 2 grams of vitamin C, typically it has antioxidative effects. But if you do very, very high doses, I got up to, at one point, although I'm now down to 60 grams, I got up to 100,000 milligrams intravenously, the 100 grams of vitamin C per IV session. And what it does, the vitamin C in your bloodstream interacts with the iron content in your blood and actually creates hydrogen peroxide in your system, which of course is very, very toxic to cancer cells and doesn't really cause any damage to your healthy cells. So those are the 3 primary kind of oxidative therapies that I did. I kind of did a lot of supplements. I don't know which ones were effective and which were not, because anything that was out there that I thought could be therapeutic, that I didn't think would cause any harm, I was willing to kind of try. I wasn't crazy, but I did decide, there were certain things that if I heard more than one integrative doctor tell me the same thing about a drug, I thought, okay, this is worth looking into, because there's a lot of doctors think, for example, IP6, which is a B vitamin, which is bound with phosphorus, 6 molecules of phosphorus, which is why they call it IP6. It's been around a long time, but it's only recently been tested on cancer, and it kind of enhances apoptosis and inhibits angiogenesis. At least that's what the theories are. So things like that, B17, Laetrile, artesunate, artemisinin, these are all cancer-focused supplements. And so I did a lot of that as well. I took my ketogenic diet from, just a nutritional ketogenic to a therapeutic ketogenic, which means you want to be over 2 millimolars versus, I think, 0.5 is what you're technically in ketosis. And the theory behind that, I'm sure a lot of people know about this. If you do adopt the Warburg theory of cancer and you understand that glucose feeds cancer, in fact, I think the most telling evidence how powerful glucose is at feeding cancer is one of the methods that they use to determine whether or not you have cancer when they do a CT scan or a PET scan is they inject a glucose into your bloodstream that has radioisotopes in it. And then they look for where that gets coagulated, like there's parts of your body where it all kind of collects. That's where you have cancer, because the cancer just sucks up that glucose. And so I think the less glucose you have floating in your system, the less cancer cells have their primary means of energy production, which is that glucose. So burning ketones necessarily, I think, inhibits the growth of the cancer cell. I wouldn't say it's going to kill them or starve them off, because they can convert to other forms of glutamine is another form of that they can use in addition to glucose for the energy production. But it certainly slows it down and inhibits it. And at the same time, it strengthens your mitochondria for your healthy cells, which is what you want to do. You want to have your healthy cells remain healthy, because you don't want them to decide, oh, let's go off grid too. Let's join that party, right? And so you want to keep all your healthy cells functioning the way they should. So Some people have difficulty with burning ketones. I don't.
Mm.
So the ketogenic diet was another one. In my view, one of the major components of the healing process, we can talk a little about detoxification. That's one that I think a lot of people who have read other books on cancer will know about, because detoxification is key. They say you want to get all these toxins out of your system so your immune system is not challenged and it's free to fight the cancer, et cetera. Is your lymphatic system, which is kind of often overlooked. In fact, people will take out your lymph cells quickly if they discover cancer cells inside them. And in my view, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, and I don't purport to be an expert, but in my limited perspective, I think, well, the lymphatic system is supposed to be collecting your cancer cells and getting out of your system, and even if they're sacrificing themselves to do so. And so you want your lymphatic system to be functioning at its highest level. And so that requires movement, rebounding, skin brushing, lymphatic massage, hydration, walking. I kind of try to break all this down on my website, but I think having a good functioning lymphatic system is really important. If you have cancer and you're able to get, even if you use standard of care, chemotherapy, radiation, or just do it with alternative treatment, you're able to start killing off those cancer cells. Your body has to be able to clean that stuff out. Otherwise, you can have serious adverse health consequences just from all the dead cancer cells floating around your system. So the lymph system is your front line of defense on that.
And did you do saunas as well?
I do. I have an infrared sauna. I do that just, again, to help strengthen the mitochondria and as a detoxification, just to kind of clean things out.
Mm. And Eric, one other thing that you haven't mentioned yet that I know that you're a big, big believer of is intermittent fasting.
Yes. That's exactly where I was going to go next. One of the reasons why I think I came down with such an aggressive form of cancer is because I was so intent on being healthy that I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing. I had created this incredible concoction I had every day, this incredible smoothie I would make in my Vitamix blender every day that had tons and tons of nutrients. It's crazy what I was going through. I was putting natto in there and raw liver and all the vitamins and the maca and this and the that. And my theory was, if a little bit of this is good for you, a lot of this must be really good for you, which is really, that was so misguided. And I was never, ever allowing my body to, go through the redox effect of cleaning itself out. I was just constantly feeding it. And that's one of the reasons why not only do I think I got sick, but why I ended up with such an aggressive form of cancer, because it was like, you put enough fertilizer in your garden. It's not just your flowers that are going to be happy. The weeds are going to be happy too. I'm a big proponent now for fasting generally, not only to kind of get your ketone levels up, but also to allow your cells to clean themselves out. That's the autophagy. That's necessary for proper cellular health. And so intermittent fasting is a good way to kind of, give your body a chance to kind of do what it needs to do on the cleansing cycle. So I do intermittent fast, and I do kind of a more extended fast on a regular basis, like 2 or 3 days every month or two, just to kind of give my cells a chance to really clean themselves out, which is something I had never done before, and which I think I should have been doing in hindsight.
So with all that you know now, Eric, if a close friend or a family member got diagnosed with a cancer of sorts, what would you say to them, I guess, if you were to advise them in steps to take?
Well, of course, the first thing I'd say is I'm not a doctor. I do get a lot of calls, and I do take calls from people, and I'm hopefully not going to have to do that too much because it gets a little overwhelming, but I'm happy to do it now because I think it's so important. And I do get that question. If there's metastases involved, I strongly encourage them to get into a hyperbaric chamber. I say the first thing you need to do is get any sugar out of your system. So if you're drinking apple juice, stop drinking apple juice. I want you to really bring down your level of glucose as best you can. And if you have to phase it down because you've been a sugar burner for a long time, phase it down, but do the best you can to get out of that sugar burning state as quickly as possible is the second thing I do.
And I'm sure you wouldn't wait for them to get cancer to tell someone that either.
No.
Because they're cancering anyway, right?
No, it's true. There's all these books written now about how toxic sugar is. And when I say sugar, I mean carbohydrates generally. I mean, I know that plants have carbohydrates too, and I'm a big proponent of eating plants. I think vegetables are great, but I don't have a lot of fruit in my diet because of the sugar content. Those are kind of the two primary things. And then I say kind of hydration is really important, because if you're not properly hydrated, your cells are just not going to communicate or function properly. So you really want to make sure you're well hydrated. And hydration is not as simple as just drinking a lot of water. As I'm sure you know, Al, you're an athlete, right? You have to have the right electrolyte balance. And, you want to make sure you're drinking clean water. I'm doing a lot of research now on kind of hydrogen and the effects of hydrogen in water. There's been a lot of work done recently on deuterium. I don't want to get too far off your question, but deuterium is a hydrogen molecule that's twice the size of a normal hydrogen molecule. It's just heavy hydrogen is what it is. And it's a very, very, very small element in the atmosphere and in food and in water and everything. And the problem with deuterium is if it gets into your mitochondria, it effectively gums up the works. So what you want to do is you want to reduce the amount of deuterium you're exposed to. And so there's a lot of kind of deuterium depleted water studies going on. And I went to this metabolic therapeutics conference down in Florida where near Dom D'Agostino, who's big in the kind of exogenous ketone space. And they did a whole session on deuterium depletion. And that got me started in this space. But I think one of the reasons why, for example, a plant-based diet can be efficacious and the ketogenic diet can be efficacious. And they're both you can have a high-fat plant-based diet, which is probably extremely effective because you have kind of the best of both worlds. But the reason why they're both, I think, effective ways of addressing cancer is because they traditionally are low deuterium diets. The water inside a plant is all exclusion zone water, which Pollack talks about in his book on the fourth phase of water. If you're going to juice, obviously you're getting that. So, if you're going to juice, make sure you're juicing high water, but just vegetables and no fruits and that sort of thing. To get back to your question, this kind of advice that I would give would be based on kind of your lifestyle needs to be adjusted because it could be stress factors. It could be a lot of things that kind of created the condition in the first place that you want to make sure you don't ignore. You kind of change your internal landscape. And so, are you sleeping at night? How stressed out are you? I mean, I know it's hard when you have cancer not to be stressed. That's a significant challenge.
And what about advice on how to deal with it in terms of what therapies to go for and which ones to avoid?
I typically will tell people, look, if you can do it, if you have the means and you live in an area where it's possible, because I know some areas it's kind of hard to find good alternative doctors, find yourself a team of good doctors, but do your own research. In other words, you want a good oncologist, you want a good integrative doctor, and then you want to make sure that you've done your homework. I think I fill the third bucket because I'm trying to help people kind of come to the doctor's office with enough knowledge so that they can kind of help guide the healing therapeutic intervention protocols. The reason I say that is I don't care if you see the best doctor in the world. Let's say a person gets to see Chris Kresser as a doctor. You're still only going to get a limited amount of attention, right? That person is not going to have the time to put as much focus on your condition as is going to be necessary for you really to address everything you need to address in order to get back in a healing state. It's up to each individual who's confronting this condition to really kind of assume that role. I wouldn't be in a position, for example, unless I were to spend every waking minute with the person to sit down and say, okay, you need to focus on this, you need to focus on that. Everybody who's confronted this condition and who wants to really kind of take charge needs to take charge, right? So you want to surround yourself with good doctors so you can get the blood work done. You can get whatever prescriptions you need to get filled. You also need to kind of do a lot of your own soul searching and deciding kind of what fits into your lifestyle, where your lifestyle is deficient and where you need to make adjustments. What dietary regimens will work for you. Not everyone has the time to make their own food. I'm blessed because one of the benefits of being on this ketogenic diet is since I'm only eating 1 or 2 meals a day, it's a lot easier for me to make sure I'm eating healthy. If I was eating 3 meals a day, it would be more of a challenge.
But I think, Eric, the difference is you've actually taken control and you've decided that this is absolutely the most important thing in your life, health, which is a good decision. And you've decided to be a master in it.
Yes, absolutely. I love it. It's my passion. I love coming up with these creative meals that are very healthy, that taste great, that are easy to make. And to me, it's fun. It's creativity at its best. I'm enjoying it.
One other opinion I wanted to ask you was I heard Robin Openshaw recently recommend a healing retreat centre in Switzerland that was just for cancer healing. Do you know of any places that people could go if they were diagnosed with cancer where they could potentially be on a retreat and start healing?
I've gotten several people who have reached out to me with recommendations on that, Allie, but I haven't really been able to do any diligence or research to come to determination as to whether they're good or bad or, are they valuable or how effective are they. I do think that if someone is doing a major shift in their life from being kind of traditional American diet, standard American diet, now be very, very healthy, that's a great way to kickstart it. So maybe the center in Switzerland is a great place to go. I would have to do more research before I can say. I do have my own perspective is that if I personally had to do chemotherapy, which I don't, I'm not in that position, but if I ever found myself in that position, I would seriously consider going to a clinic. There's several of them in Europe. There's a lot of them that are in Germany where they use IPT, which is insulin potentiated treatment. And what they do is they lower your blood sugar by injecting insulin into your system to the point where you can't hardly get out of bed, right? The idea is to get your blood sugar down to very, very low levels. And then what they do is they use low-dose chemotherapy in conjunction with glucose, and they inject it into your system. And similar to what we talked about earlier with those radioisotopes, the cancer just eats it up and invariably ends up with a ton of the chemotherapy without it going through all your system. So there are some clinics here in the U.S. that do that. My integrative doctor is down in Irvine, and they do IPT in Irvine. But the reason I think I would probably leaning on getting on an airplane going to Germany to do it is just because they do a lot of it there. So they've been doing it for a long time. It's less fringy for them. So I would say that, the suggestion of going to one of those 2-week or week-long or month-long, whatever it is, cleansing sessions is a great idea for those that have to really kind of make a major shift. I was so clean because I was not eating anything that was an organic. And then my beef was all grass-fed, and my salmon was all wild, and my water was all out of a glass bottle, that when I got diagnosed with cancer, that I didn't even consider that to be necessary.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting you mentioned the benefits of the hyperbaric chamber. We actually had Hunter on the show. He's the head of Omni, which is the most amazing club soon to be opened next year, I believe, in New York. And they're actually going to have a hyperbaric chamber there. And it's going to be one of the proper hard shell, $150,000 million or however much they cost. And
right, they're expensive.
It's actually going to be available for athletes to use as well.
That's great. I'm a big fan of hyperbaric. I mean, I do it once a week. I've been off it for a little while, but I'll get back on it. But I think there's lots of reasons to do it, even if you don't have cancer. It's just a very healthy way of forcing oxygen into all your cells. I also do EWAT, which is exercise with oxygen therapy, which is kind of a similar concept, although obviously it's not highly pressurized oxygen. But what you do is you exercise on an elliptical device or whatever you want to use, a treadmill, and you wear a mask that mimics high altitude. So it restricts the oxygen, and you're hooked onto this giant bladder that you use an oxygen generator to fill it with mostly oxygen. It's not pure oxygen, but it's something like 80% oxygen. And once you kind of reach the point where you feel like you're winded, like you're a kid and you have to get off your bike and push it up the hill, you throw a switch, and instead of being at 15,000 feet, you're now breathing pure oxygen. The theory behind that is your circulatory system your veins will open up, your capillaries will open up as best they can because your body's starving for oxygen. And then you just flood your system with oxygen. So that's another thing I do.
It's an amazing feeling. Do you do that on a regular basis, Eric?
I try to. I just have so many things going on. When I first started doing it, I was doing it regularly. Now I get to it once or twice a week if I'm lucky. I just have so much going on. My life is really busy.
On that note, I have to let you go. But before I do, can I ask you just one question? And that is, do you have a tattoo?
No, I don't.
I ask all the guests on the show. Have you ever thought about it?
I have. I mean, I've toyed with the idea. I do a lot of yoga. It's my passion now. And here in Los Angeles, it's probably the same in New York, but here in Los Angeles, I'm fortunate in Santa Monica where I live, we have some of the best yoga instructors, I think, in the world. And a lot of them are, men who are just completely covered in tattoos. So it's kind of a current trend. I wouldn't do kind of the mass tattoo thing. I would do something a little more subtle. Something more like Ben Greenfield does, where it's just like on one arm.
Excellent, Eric. Look, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm going to put your website in the show notes. And
okay.
I heard a rumor that you are actually writing a book. And so if people go to your website and, I don't know, put their email address in or something, will you keep everyone informed as to when the book's coming out?
I will. I will absolutely do that.
And what is your website?
Fact, I'd love to get feedback from people on the site itself. You can contact me from the site. My email's on there. I do respond, not always right away because I'm busy, but when I can, I definitely respond to everybody.
And what's your website?
It's Quest to Cure Cancer.
Quest to Cure Cancer, and that'll be in the show notes. Eric, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Ali.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.